My name is Margaret Callahan. I thought I'd seen my fair share of audacity in my 66 years until the evening my daughter-in-law looked me straight in the eye in my own dining room and told me I'd need to start paying her and my son a monthly sum for food and accommodation. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. It was a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were usually quiet. No visiting relatives, no special meals, just the three of us sharing whatever I'd cooked. I'd made a pot roast that night, the kind that had been a family favorite for years. The smell filled the house as I set the table, and I thought foolishly that we'd be settling in for a calm, pleasant evening. She waited until we'd finished eating. My son had leaned back in his chair, patting his stomach in that satisfied way he always did, and I was just about to start clearing plates when she folded her hands neatly on the table and said it. "Margaret, we've been talking, and we think it's only fair if you start contributing a set amount each month. For groceries and utilities, food and accommodation." For a moment I thought I'd misheard her. The words sounded so absurd, so upside down that my mind rejected them outright. I own this house. I paid the down payment, the mortgage, the taxes. I replaced the roof, fixed the plumbing, redid the kitchen all long before they ever moved in. I had let them live here rent-free after their wedding, thinking I was helping them get a start in life. And now she was sitting here in my dining room at my table telling me to pay her for the privilege of living under my own roof. I glanced at my son, expecting to see shock on his face, but he wouldn't meet my eyes. He picked at a bit of roast on his plate, his mouth pressed in a thin, uncomfortable line. That told me everything they'd already discussed this. He'd already agreed. I set my fork down carefully, buying myself a moment. "I beg your pardon?" She smiled, a small, tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, you've been here for a while now, and with the cost of everything going up, it just makes sense that we all contribute. We've been shouldering the grocery bills and utilities, and it's starting to feel unbalanced." Unbalanced. The word rattled around in my head like a marble in a glass jar. Unbalanced was me buying their wedding rings when my son couldn't afford them. Unbalanced was covering the hospital bills when she had complications during her pregnancy with my grandson. Unbalanced was me taking care of the house, cleaning, gardening, cooking most nights without ever asking for a cent from them. I took a slow breath. "And what amount were you thinking?" She named a figure. Not outrageous, but enough to make a point, and that point wasn't about money. It was about control. About changing the narrative from "we're living in Margaret's house" to "Margaret lives with us." I didn't answer right away. I just nodded slowly, as if I were considering it, while inside me something cold and deliberate was taking shape. Because this wasn't just a request. This was a test. And I've lived long enough to know that when you let someone rewrite the rules in your own home, you don't get them back without a fight. I stood gathering the plates. "I'll think about it," I said calmly, carrying them into the kitchen. I could feel her watching me, waiting for me to bristle or snap. But I've learned that silence, the right kind of silence, can be far more unsettling than anger. By the time I turned on the tap to rinse the dishes, my mind was already moving ahead. I would play along, at least for now. Let them think I was mulling it over. Because the more rope they thought they had, the easier it would be to show everyone exactly what they were doing. And make no mistake, I wasn't about to start paying rent in my own house. That night, long after they'd gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen with the lights dimmed and a cup of tea cooling between my hands. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, but my mind was anything but still. It wasn't the amount she'd asked for that kept circling in my head, it was the principle. The audacity. This wasn't about splitting grocery bills or paying a fair share of utilities. This was about rewriting the story of who owned this house, who held authority under its roof. And she wanted that story to change. I thought back to the day my son had asked if he and his new wife could move in. They'd been married just a few months, still finding their footing. He'd said it would be just for a little while so they could save up for a place of their own. I'd said yes without hesitation. I remember even feeling a touch of excitement, the idea of family under one roof again, the house full of voices and laughter. But it hadn't taken long for small changes to creep in. The first time she rearranged my kitchen cabinets to make them more efficient, I'd told myself it was harmless. When she started insisting on handling the grocery shopping herself, I chalked it up to her wanting to cook for her husband. But then, there were the private conversations between them that would stop abruptly when I entered the room, the subtle shifts in their tone when talking about our home, theirs, not ours. I'd ignored it. I'd told myself I was imagining things, that I was being oversensitive. But now, with her demand still ringing in my ears, I knew I'd been right all along. I took a sip of the now lukewarm tea and glanced around the kitchen. The cabinets I'd chosen, the table I'd saved 3 months' worth of paychecks for when I was still working at the library, the curtains I'd sewn myself. Every corner of this house carried my fingerprints, my years of work and care. And yet somehow she felt bold enough to sit across from me and suggest I pay her to stay here. I knew I couldn't rush my next move. If I confronted her too directly, she'd twist the conversation, play the victim, and my son would be caught in the middle. Or worse, he'd side with her outright. No, I needed time. Time to think, to watch, to collect what I needed. Because this wasn't just about telling her no. It was about making sure she never tried something like this again. I rinsed my mug and set it in the sink. The clock on the wall read 12:47 a.m. I turned off the kitchen light and padded quietly to my room. As I slipped into bed, I felt the weight of the situation settle into something cold and solid inside me. This was my house, my home. And if they wanted to treat me like an unwanted guest, they were about to find out just how unwelcome they could feel. When I think back to the day they moved in, I can still see it so clearly. It was early spring, the air just starting to soften, the grass in the yard still patchy from winter. My son pulled into the driveway with a rented moving truck, and I remember waving from the porch, genuinely happy to see them. My daughter-in-law stepped out first, neat ponytail, bright smile, a bouquet of supermarket flowers in her hands. "This is just for a little while," she'd said, as she hugged me, her perfume light and citrusy. "We'll be out of your hair before you know it." I'd smiled and told her there was no rush. I meant it. At the time, I believed I was doing what any mother would do, offering my home as a safe harbor while they got on their feet. They'd been through a rough patch financially. My son's job was steady but not spectacular. Hers was part-time and barely covered her student loans. I knew the cost of rent in town, even the smallest apartments would eat up most of their income. Letting them stay here felt like the right thing, the loving thing. And in those early weeks it was almost nice. We'd have dinner together most nights, the three of us chatting about work, the news, little things. She'd compliment my cooking, ask for recipes, and sometimes help me in the kitchen. My son seemed relaxed, and I told myself I'd made the right choice. But as the months passed, subtle changes began to creep in. The first time I noticed, it was in the kitchen. I'd gone to make tea one morning and opened the cabinet where I kept the mugs, only to find everything rearranged. Mugs moved to the opposite side, glasses where the bowls had been, spices lined up in a completely different order. "Oh, I just made things more efficient," she'd said cheerfully when I asked. "Now everything's grouped by size and color." I laughed it off, but the truth was, it unsettled me. The kitchen was my domain, the place I'd arranged and used for decades. Still, I told myself it was just her way of helping, of feeling useful. Then came the grocery situation. At first we shopped together, but after a few trips she began insisting she handle it alone. "It's easier," she said. "I know what we need and I can grab deals." I didn't see the harm until the day I opened the pantry to find none of the staples I'd always kept on hand. Whole wheat flour gone. My favorite brand of tea replaced with something cheaper. Even the olive oil had been swapped out for a generic bottle. When I mentioned it, she smiled and said, "Oh, I'm just trying to streamline things. You can always buy your own if you want something special." It was such a small comment, but it stuck with me. The pantry I'd stocked for years was now being managed by someone who acted as though I were a guest. Conversations between her and my son began to shift too. I'd walk into the room, and they'd go quiet. Sometimes I'd hear snippets before they noticed me talk about our space, or how we like things here. It was subtle, but the language was changing. This wasn't my home in their minds. It was becoming ours, and I was the one who needed to adapt. The turning point came last summer when I decided to repaint the guest room. I'd been meaning to do it for ages. The wallpaper was peeling, and the color felt dated. I bought paintbrushes, drop cloths, but when I mentioned my plans, she frowned. "Oh, maybe we should discuss that. I'm not sure that color would go with the rest of the house." I almost laughed. The rest of the house. The colors. The furniture. The curtains. Every bit of it had been chosen by me over decades. She'd lived here less than 2 years, but I swallowed my irritation and let it go. Now, sitting in my room weeks after her food and accommodation demand, I realized just how many of those small moments I'd let slide. I'd told myself I was keeping the peace, but in reality, I'd been giving her inch after inch until she thought she could take a mile. And that mile had arrived in the form of her neat little proposal at the dinner table. I tried to imagine the conversation she must have had with my son before bringing it to me. Had she framed it as a matter of fairness, as if I were some unrelated boarder eating into their budget? Or had she been more blunt, painting me as a burden they'd been too polite to confront? Either way, he'd gone along with it. That was the part that hurt more than I expected, not just her audacity, but his silence. As I sat there thinking, a memory surfaced from years ago when my own mother came to live with me for a while after her hip surgery. She'd stayed in the spare room, and though money was tight for me then, it never once occurred to me to charge her for food and accommodation. She was my mother. It was her home as much as mine. The difference between how I had treated her and how I was being treated now was stark. And it told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about money. It was about shifting power. I decided that night I would not confront her directly, not yet. Confrontation would give her the chance to spin the story to paint me as unreasonable. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I would observe, document, gather the kind of proof that left no room for twisting. And then, when the time was right, I would remind her and my son exactly whose name was on the deed to this house. From that night on, I began to watch. Not the casual, half-distracted way you might keep an eye on a new neighbor or a chatty coworker, no. This was the kind of watching I'd honed during my 35 years as a librarian, where you notice details without letting anyone see that you're paying attention. People forget that libraries are excellent places to study human behavior. When you've spent decades tracking who borrows what, who returns things on time, and who forgets until you send a reminder, you get good at patterns. And my daughter-in-law had a pattern. The first layer of it was in how she handled the kitchen. It wasn't just rearranging shelves or picking her preferred brands anymore. It was about territory. One Saturday morning, I came downstairs to find her already making breakfast. The smell of bacon filled the air, toast popped up from the toaster, and eggs sizzled in the pan. On the surface, it looked like kindness until I noticed the subtle choreography she used to block me. Every time I moved toward the counter to get a mug, she'd shift slightly, as if accidentally taking up more space. When I reached for the cupboard with the tea, she'd slide in front of it with a smile. "Oh, I'll get that for you." And when I tried to help with the eggs, she'd say, "No, no, you sit down, it's easier if I do it." Easier for whom, I wondered. That afternoon, while she was out, I started keeping notes in a small spiral-bound notebook I kept in my nightstand. Date, time, what happened, exact wording, if I could remember it. Not because I planned to wave it under her nose, not yet, but because I knew that when the time came, I'd need more than vague complaints. I'd need a record. Within a week, I had my first full page. Monday refused to let me load dishwasher, said I'll do it later my way. Wednesday moved my baking supplies to the top shelf out of my reach without a step stool. Thursday, told neighbor we had been covering all the grocery bills since I moved in. That last one stopped me cold. I was on the porch watering my plants when I overheard her chatting with Mrs. Peterson next door. They were standing just close enough to the hedge for me to hear. "Oh, it's been an adjustment," my daughter-in-law was saying. "We've been covering all the groceries and utilities since Margaret moved in. You know how it is, every little bit adds up." Mrs. Peterson, bless her, sounded confused. "But isn't it?" She trailed off, probably remembering that this was my house. I didn't wait to hear more. I went inside, my face hot. "Moved in." She'd made it sound like I was some distant aunt they'd taken pity on. And she'd said it to a neighbor who'd known me for 20 years, who'd been in this house countless times when my son was still in school. That evening, I made a point of being overly gracious at dinner. "This roast is delicious," I told her. "Thank you for cooking." She beamed, mistaking my politeness for acceptance. In truth, I was testing how she responded when I acknowledged her efforts. Sure enough, by the next morning, she'd left a sticky note on the fridge. "Please transfer $50 to the grocery account for this week's shopping, thanks." I didn't. I simply went about my business as if I hadn't seen it. 2 days later, she brought it up at the table right in front of my son. "Margaret, I'm still waiting for your grocery contribution." I looked at her with my calmest librarian expression, the one I used to give patrons who were loudly arguing about overdue fines. "I'll think about it." She opened her mouth to push, but my son changed the subject. That's when I noticed the second layer of her pattern. She rarely confronted me directly without an audience. Alone, she'd make hints, ask casual questions about my expenses, or frame things as if she were giving me helpful advice. But with others present, my son, a neighbor, a relative, she'd be more pointed, planting seeds that I was a dependent someone they were generously supporting. It was clever, I'll give her that. Reputation damage by 1,000 small cuts. I started to test the boundaries more deliberately. One week, I stopped stocking the pantry with the items I usually contributed: coffee, fruit, certain staples. By Wednesday, she was complaining loudly about having to buy everything while my son nodded along. I wrote it all down. The more I observed, the clearer it became. She was laying the groundwork to flip the narrative completely. In her version, I was no longer the homeowner who had offered them shelter. I was a guest, one who had overstayed her welcome and needed to start paying for the privilege. What she didn't know was that I had already begun to gather my own groundwork. Not just notes on her behavior, but the property deed, the mortgage statements and receipts for every major repair and improvement I'd paid for over the years. All neatly filed, ready for the day I'd have to set the record straight. And that day, I realized, was getting closer. The conversation happened on a Tuesday night, not because I planned it that way, but because sometimes the right moment presents itself like a book falling open to the exact page you need. It was after dinner. My son had gone upstairs to take a shower, and my daughter-in-law was stacking plates into the dishwasher. Normally, she liked to have him present during serious talks with me, a built-in witness, and perhaps a silent source of pressure. But this time she was alone, humming softly as she arranged the cutlery with unnecessary precision. I decided it was time to flip the script. "I've been thinking about what you said last week." I began, leaning casually against the counter. My voice was calm, deliberate. Years in the library had taught me that the right tone could make someone lean in without realizing they were doing it. She glanced up, cautious but curious. About me contributing for food and accommodation." I gave her a small, almost amused smile. "I have to say, it's an interesting proposition." Her shoulders seemed to straighten. "Well, I just think it's fair. We're all living here, we all use the same resources." So I held up a hand, not enough to interrupt rudely, but enough to make her pause. "Let's talk about that. You've been here 2 years now. In that time, have you ever once had to pay rent?" She blinked. No, but. Or a mortgage. I continued. Or property taxes. Or for the roof repair last winter, the new water heater, the plumbing work. Her mouth tightened. That's different. Those are house expenses I finished for her. Yes, they are. And they've been paid every single month without fail. By me. I let that hang in the air for a moment. She was gripping the edge of the counter, now her knuckles pale. But you're not working, she said finally, her voice lowering as if she were revealing a shameful secret. And it's not fair for us to cover all the groceries. When I tilted my head. When what? She faltered. When you don't have any income. I almost laughed, but I kept my face neutral. My income is none of your concern. But since you brought it up, I receive a pension and I've managed my finances carefully enough to own this house outright. That means I have no rent, no mortgage, and no landlord to answer to. I stepped a little closer, keeping my voice soft. Do you know what that means legally? She hesitated. That it's yours, that it's mine, I confirmed. Every room, every wall, every piece of ground it sits on. And as long as you and my son live here, you are my guests. Guests do not charge the host for food and lodging. Quite the opposite, in fact. Her lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't mean, oh, I think you did, I said gently. And that's fine. You're entitled to think whatever you like. But let's be clear. I will not be paying you to live in my own home. That conversation is finished. I turned to leave the kitchen, but then stopped and looked back over my shoulder. And just so we're on the same page, any further discussions about finances will happen with my son present, and with me leading the conversation. I left her standing there, the hum of the dishwasher filling the silence. Upstairs in my room, I felt a strange combination of calm and adrenaline. I hadn't raised my voice, but the point had landed. Whether she admitted it or not, she now knew I wasn't as malleable as she thought. Of course, I also knew this wouldn't be the end of it. People like her didn't back down after a single confrontation. They adapted. They tested the edges again and again until they found a new angle. The next morning proved me right. I came downstairs to find a printed household budget taped to the fridge. It listed groceries, utilities, and miscellaneous shared expenses with a column of numbers neatly totaled at the bottom. My name was handwritten beside a figure in the contribution section. I took it down without comment, folded it neatly, and slid it into my notebook with the other documentation. She wanted to play games. Fine. I could play much, much longer. That afternoon, I called a locksmith. The locksmith arrived the next morning, his van pulling into the driveway, just as my daughter-in-law was leaving for a yoga class. She spotted him as she was backing her car out, and I saw the confusion flicker across her face before she rolled down the window. What's going on? She asked. Maintenance, I said simply, holding up the set of brass keys in my hand. House security needs updating. Her mouth opened like she wanted to ask more, but I gave her the polite closed-lip smile that ends a conversation. She drove away without pushing further, but I could almost hear the mental gears turning behind her eyes. The locksmith, a polite man named Carl, worked quickly. I had him change the locks on the front and back doors, install a new deadbolt on the side entry, and most importantly, put a keyed lock on my bedroom door. It wasn't that I feared theft exactly. It was that I no longer trusted the boundaries in this house. Privacy, I'd learned, was only secure if you locked it yourself. By the time he left, I had a fresh set of keys and a renewed sense of control. I didn't tell my son immediately, not because I wanted to hide it from him, but because I knew any reaction would be colored by whatever his wife fed him first. I wanted him to hear it from me when the timing was right. The next few days were almost unnervingly quiet. My daughter-in-law kept her voice sweet, her questions casual. She didn't bring up the budget I'd removed from the fridge, but her eyes lingered on my keyring more than once, as though she were silently counting the new shapes and colors there. I used the lull to make other changes. First, I reclaimed the pantry. One afternoon, while they were both out, I moved my food items back to their original spots and labeled the shelves in my neat librarian handwriting, "Margaret's items do not move." I even took a picture of the arrangement for my records. Next, I took over the utility accounts. Since the house was in my name, it was a simple matter of calling the companies and having all bills sent directly to me again. I set them up for automatic payment from my account. That way, there could be no "we've been covering the utilities" narrative floating around the neighborhood. Then I began cooking again, not every night, but enough to remind them that I wasn't a passive occupant in my own home. I made the dishes my son had grown up with: beef stew, chicken pot pie, the lemon bars he loved as a teenager. I served them without fanfare, but I saw the way my daughter-in-law's smile tightened whenever my son complimented the meal. It was subtle warfare, nothing overtly hostile, but enough to shift the balance back toward me. And yet, I knew she was planning something. It came a week later over Sunday breakfast. My son had just poured his coffee when she cleared her throat and slid a folded sheet of paper across the table toward him. "I've been working on something," she said brightly. He opened it, scanning the neat columns of handwriting. "What is this?" "Our new household agreement," she explained, glancing at me before returning her gaze to him. "Just to make sure everything is fair. Everyone pays their share for groceries, utilities, and upkeep. That way, no one feels taken advantage of." My son hesitated. "This is for all three of us?" "Yes," she said quickly. "Including your mother." I set down my fork. "No." Her head whipped toward me. "Excuse me." I met her stare evenly. "No, I will not be signing any household agreement that suggests I owe rent or expenses in my own home. And I'd advise you to think very carefully before you push this any further." My son frowned. "Mom, maybe we should—" I turned to him, softening my voice. "Daniel, do you know whose name is on the deed to this house?" He shifted in his chair. "Yours." "Correct. And do you know what that means?" "That it's yours," he said reluctantly. "That it's mine," I echoed. "I let you both live here rent-free so you could save for your future. If that arrangement no longer works for you, we can discuss a move-out timeline. But I will not under any circumstances pay to live here." The silence that followed was heavy. My daughter-in-law's cheeks flushed, and I could see the effort it took for her to bite back her next words. She stood abruptly, muttering something about being late to meet a friend, and left the table. Daniel sighed. "Mom, you could have handled that more gently." I smiled faintly. I was gentle. "You haven't seen me be otherwise." What I didn't tell him was that this was only the second phase of my plan. She thought this was about a monthly payment. I knew it was about control. And I had every intention of making sure control stayed exactly where it belonged. Because this wasn't just my house, it was my home. And I was done letting anyone treat me like a tenant in it. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was upset, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't a little sting from Daniel's "you could have been gentler" comment, but because I knew exactly what I had to do next. People make the mistake of thinking conflict is about the present moment. It rarely is. The real battle happens months before, in the quiet hours when you're gathering facts, preparing documents, and positioning yourself so that when the storm hits, you're already standing on higher ground. I had learned that lesson long before my daughter-in-law entered the picture. At 8 the next morning, I was at my desk in the small study that overlooked the garden. The room had always been my sanctuary: walls lined with bookshelves, a mahogany desk I'd polished every week for years, and a filing cabinet stuffed with a lifetime's worth of records. I pulled open the bottom drawer and took out the folder marked House Documents. Inside were the deed, the original mortgage, long since paid off tax records, repair receipts, and even the appraisal paperwork from the last time the house had been valued. I flipped through each page, making a mental note of what might be relevant in the months ahead. Then I made a new file: Occupancy Agreement, Margaret's Home. The title wasn't accidental. My thinking was simple: if my daughter-in-law was so keen on a household agreement, I would create one myself. Only this version would be rooted in reality, a clear, legally sound statement that my son and his wife lived here at my invitation rent-free subject to my rules, and that their continued stay depended on mutual respect. I wasn't planning to shove it under their noses tomorrow. No. This was something I'd keep ready a card to play if things escalated. The next step was insurance. I called my agent, a no-nonsense woman named Beverly who had been handling my policies for over a decade. I asked her to review my homeowner's policy, making sure it included coverage for disputes with residents. She was discreet enough not to pry into why I was asking, but her tone suggested she understood. By noon, I'd also contacted a lawyer I knew from church, a man who had helped a friend of mine when her niece tried to claim a share of her property. We met for coffee later that week, and I laid out the situation in plain terms. He listened, nodding occasionally, then gave me advice that stuck: document everything. Not just the big moments, the small ones too. The way she speaks to you changes in behavior, any written requests for money. If they ever try to claim you agreed to something, you'll have proof you didn't. I was already doing that, of course, but hearing it from a lawyer reinforced the importance. Meanwhile, I kept my outward demeanor unchanged. Around the house, I was polite, but firm. I didn't rise to her little provocations the way she'd forget to set a place for me at dinner or move my laundry basket so I couldn't find it. Every time, I simply corrected the action and moved on, as though I hadn't noticed the intent behind it. But make no mistake, I noticed everything. Then came the phone call from Mrs. Peterson. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said hesitantly, "but I thought you should know I ran into your daughter-in-law at the store, and she mentioned that she and Daniel are planning to move. Once you decide whether you can manage on your own." My stomach tightened. Did she say why I wouldn't be able to manage? "She implied you might need more care," Mrs. Peterson said gently. "Like, a facility. A facility." That was the moment I realized her endgame. She wasn't just after a few $100s a month, she was planting the idea that I couldn't live alone, that I was dependent, that maybe for my own good I should hand over the house and move somewhere more suitable. It was a smart play if I hadn't seen it coming. That night, I called my lawyer again. We discussed what I'd need to prove my competence if it ever came to that: medical records, a doctor's statement, even testimony from neighbors or friends about my daily life. He suggested getting the paperwork preemptively. The next day, I scheduled a full physical with my physician, Dr. Keller. I told her everything: the insinuations, the request for money, the comments to neighbors. She shook her head, clearly annoyed on my behalf, and made a note in my file: "Patient is physically and mentally fit to live independently." She even signed a statement to that effect for me to keep in my records. I walked out of her office with the paper tucked into my bag like a shield. Back home, I went about my evening as if nothing had changed. I made myself a cup of tea, read a few chapters of a mystery novel, and listened to the faint sound of my son and his wife talking in the next room. But inside, I was already 3 steps ahead. She thought she was maneuvering me toward a trap. What she didn't realize was that I'd been quietly building my way out, and when the time came, I'd walk right past her, leaving her staring at a locked door she didn't have the key to. In my younger years, I used to believe that truth always won on its own, that people given time would naturally see what was real. I don't believe that anymore. Truth needs a little help. Sometimes, a lot. By the time Mrs. Peterson told me what my daughter-in-law had been saying, I understood I was fighting on 2 fronts: inside my home and outside it. She wasn't just trying to control me. She was shaping the story of me for Daniel, for the neighbors, maybe even for my extended family. And if I let that version stand, it wouldn't matter how capable I was. So I decided to take control of the narrative. It began quietly. I started making myself more visible in the community again. I attended church every Sunday, stayed afterward for coffee, and made a point of chatting with people I hadn't spoken to in months. I volunteered to help with the library's annual fundraiser, which put me in touch with old friends who still remembered me as the dependable, organized Margaret who could manage a dozen moving parts without breaking a sweat. I also started inviting people over not for big dinners but for small casual visits. A neighbor dropping by for tea, an old colleague stopping in to return a book. These visits served two purposes. They reminded others that I was socially active and independent, and they gave them first-hand glimpses of me running my household without help. One Tuesday, I invited Mrs. Lang from across the street to join me for lunch. We sat in the kitchen, sunlight streaming through the windows as I prepared a simple meal of grilled salmon and salad. She kept remarking on how spry I looked, how well I moved around the kitchen. I didn't press the point, I didn't have to. I made sure Daniel noticed too. Every time he came home, there was some evidence of my activity: fresh baked bread cooling on the counter, a freshly trimmed hedge outside a basket of library books on the hall table. If my daughter-in-law wanted to plant seeds of doubt, I was going to plant a forest of proof. But the most strategic move was with Daniel himself. One Saturday morning, I asked if he could help me replace the battery in my smoke detector. As he stood on the step stool, I said, "You know, I've been thinking about making some updates to the house. A fresh coat of paint in the living room, maybe new curtains. Would you help me pick colors?" He glanced down at me, a little surprised. "Sure. I didn't know you were thinking about redecorating." I admitted, but I realized I've been letting things slide. And that's not like me. I want to make sure this place stays in good shape. After all, it's not just where we live, it's my investment. That word investment landed. I saw it in his eyes. A reminder that this house wasn't just a backdrop to our lives. It was something I had built, maintained, and protected long before his marriage. The next week, I took it a step further. I invited Daniel to come with me to the bank. "Just to update my account information," I said casually. In reality, I wanted him to see that I still handled my finances independently, that I had my own income and savings. We sat together with the banker going over routine paperwork, and I noticed how his posture shifted slightly, as if the idea of me being dependent was already starting to lose its grip. Of course, my daughter-in-law noticed all of this, and she didn't like it. Her response was to turn up the sugar in her interactions with me. Suddenly, she was knocking on my door to ask if I wanted tea, or offering to pick something up for me at the store. It might have fooled someone else, but I could see the calculation behind her eyes. She was monitoring me, trying to figure out what I was up to. I gave her nothing concrete. I accepted the tea with a smile, thanked her for the grocery offer, and went right on with my plans. The turning point came at the library fundraiser. I had been put in charge of the silent auction table, a job that required me to keep track of bids, chat with attendees, and handle payments at the end. Daniel and my daughter-in-law showed up halfway through the event, and I could feel her watching me from across the room. She saw me greet people, warmly laugh at shared jokes, keep the whole operation running smoothly without breaking a sweat. She saw the way people deferred to me, trusted me, respected me. And she saw Daniel notice it too. On the way home, Daniel remarked, "Mom, you were amazing today. Everyone seemed to know you." "They should," I said, with a small smile. "I've lived here for 30 years. I've always been part of this community. I didn't have to say the rest, and I'm not going anywhere." By the end of that week, the whispers from the neighbors had shifted. Mrs. Peterson mentioned that someone at church had told her I seemed more active than ever. Another neighbor commented on seeing me out gardening like the old days. Slowly, I was reclaiming my reputation from whatever shadow my daughter-in-law had tried to cast. But I knew she wasn't finished. If anything, I suspected she was starting to realize she was losing ground, and when people like her feel cornered, they don't back down. They escalate. So while I smiled at her over dinner, I kept my files in order, my keys close and my eyes open. Because if she was planning her next move, so was I. It happened on a Wednesday, The kind of middle of the week day when everyone is a little tired and a little less careful about what they say. I'd come home from the market with a bag of pears and a rotisserie chicken, planning something simple for dinner. As I set the groceries on the counter, I heard my daughter-in-law on speakerphone in the dining room. Her voice floated in bright and performative. Well, it's just not sustainable for us to cover everything. She eats here, uses the utilities, and yes, I know it's her house, but that's not the point. We have a system. A pause. A soft laugh. Exactly. Boundaries. I didn't announce myself. I simply opened the fridge, slid the chicken onto the second shelf, and took my time rinsing the pears in the sink. When I finally rounded the corner into the dining room, she jumped, thumb thudding the speaker off so fast she almost dropped the phone. "Oh, I didn't see you there," she said, with a smile that showed a little too much teeth. I was just discussing boundaries, I finished for her, mild as chamomile. Such an important topic. Color rose along her cheekbones. "It's not what you think. I wouldn't dare presume," I said, setting a pear in the fruit bowl. "Shall we test a few boundaries together? I find practical demonstrations helpful." Her eyes narrowed just for a flicker, then smoothed. "I don't know what you mean." "Start simple," I said. "Tonight, Daniel will set the table. You'll make a salad. I'll carve the chicken. After dinner, he will do the dishes and you will dry. I will wipe the counters. We will call this a pilot program in shared responsibility." She stared as if I'd just spoken Greek. "Daniel never." "Then he will learn," I said pleasantly. "Boundaries and balance." I expected an argument. Instead, she smiled like a porcelain doll and said, "Of course," in a sweet sing-song voice that any librarian could tell you meant noted. Retaliation pending. Good. Let her keep score. I had my own ledger. Dinner went smoothly to the untrained eye. Daniel, dear man, looked faintly baffled when I handed him the dish soap, but he complied. Sleeves rolled, water running. When the last plate slid into the rack, I thanked them both. Sincerely. A good auditor always thanks participants. The escalation came the next day. I returned from the library a few hours volunteering cataloging donations to find a printed spreadsheet on the kitchen island. It had color-coding line items and a title in bold: monthly household contributions proposed. There were 3 columns: Daniel, Dill, Margaret. Under each ran numbers: groceries, utilities, shared goods, paper towels, detergent, and a new, inventive line: wear and tear, depreciation. Beside that, an amount she'd probably found on some forum where people like to reinvent common sense into policy. I stood there for a long moment, admiring truly the audacity. Then I took a pen from the drawer, drew a small asterisk beside the title, and wrote beneath it in my neatest library hand: "As owner, I will continue paying property tax, insurance, repairs and replacements, roof, HVAC, water heater, plumbing appliances, lawn service, pest control, and liability. In return, residents may enjoy rent-free occupancy and utilities at my discretion, subject to house rules. Alternately, residents may vacate within 60 days to pursue an arrangement more aligned with their preferences." MC. I left the note exactly where she'd left the spreadsheet. At 5 o'clock she found it. I heard the faint intake of breath from the hallway, the paper rattle. She didn't call out. Silence is its own weather system. You learn to read pressure drops. When Daniel's car pulled in at 6, I put on water for tea and set 3 cups, peaceful as ever. She waited until we were all seated. I made a proposal, she said, voice bright, controlled, and Margaret responded. She slid the spreadsheet toward Daniel, then my annotation. "She's unwilling." Daniel skimmed both pages. He looked up at me, a question in his eyes, not hostile, not yet. "Mom, I am willing. I said to continue our original agreement. You and your wife live here rent-free while you save for your own place. In exchange, courtesy and contribution to household upkeep, the ordinary humankind are expected. If that arrangement no longer suits, say so plainly." I'll help you two find an apartment and set a reasonable move-out timeline. His gaze dropped to the paper again. I watched the thought form: taxes, insurance, the new roof in February, the hot water heater last fall, the quiet ledger of a house that does not carry itself. My daughter-in-law leaned forward, elbows on the table. It's not about money, it's about respect. If we all respect each other, we all contribute. Respect, I said, is not itemized. She smiled. Then you won't mind signing a simple agreement, just so everything is clear. On the contrary, I said mildly, clarity delights me. I reached into the sideboard and brought out a folder I'd readied that morning. Inside was my occupancy document, crisp, clear, fair. I slid it across to Daniel. This states, among other things, that you are residents at my invitation, that there is no rent, that utilities and taxes remain my responsibility, and that all parties agree to keep a civil household. It also clarifies that I may terminate your residency with 60 days' notice if the terms are not honored. He read, jaw-working. My daughter-in-law didn't touch it. This is a lot, he said at last. It's protection, I said gently. For all of us, there are moments when you can feel a scale tip. Something in Daniel's posture softened, not submission, not quite agreement, but recognition. The house had bones before his marriage, and I was the one who'd kept them upright. He nodded almost to himself. I'll look it over. Take your time, I said, rising to pour tea. That night she tried a different angle. I woke at 2 a.m. to the soft murmur of voices beneath my bedroom. Our old floors carry sound like string instruments. I lay still, listening through the wood and heat vents. She's playing you, my daughter-in-law whispered. You're falling for it. A long silence. Then Daniel, weary. It's her house. She'll never put us first, she said. We'll never build anything if she keeps control of everything. Control, he said. Or ownership, sheets rustled. A palpable folding kind of quiet. I fell asleep, smiling at the ceiling. The next day, the attack shifted again. Not spreadsheets, not arguments. Atmospherics. I came downstairs to find 2 Amazon boxes labeled with my name, but ordered by her: bulk paper towels, bulk detergent, bulk coffee filters, not my size. A yellow sticky note perched on top. Since you don't want to contribute directly, here are your supplies. Use these. A heart drawn like a stamp. I photographed the boxes, the note, and filed the images. Then I wrote a shorter note and placed it on the counter. Thank you. Please refrain from ordering items on my behalf without my consent. Unused items will be donated. A librarian learns to label the world. By Friday, I could feel the story turning outside the house. Mrs. Lang stopped me at the mailbox. Saw your roses, she said. You've still got the magic touch. Later at the grocer's, the manager asked if I'd be bringing pies to the church sale like the old days. Word of mouth was an old river. I'd set it flowing in the direction of the truth and let it run. That evening brought the boldest attempt yet. I was in the garden clipping spent blooms when a silver sedan eased to the curb. A woman in a blazer stepped out carrying a clipboard and a smile. Hi there, she called. I'm with Sunrise Senior Living. Your daughter-in-law invited us to do a complimentary home safety assessment, just standard. No, I said. She blinked. Excuse me? No assessment today? I repeated, calm as rain. Nor any other day. Oh, well, sometimes families like to. I'm sure they do, I said pleasantly. But no one schedules anything for this property without my authorization. Her eyes flicked to the porch where my daughter-in-law had materialized. Arms folded, a little wave pasted to her hand. The representative's smile wobbled. I apologize for the misunderstanding. No harm, I said. Please tell your scheduler Margaret Callahan said hello, and that we won't be needing services. Ever. The woman left in a hurry. My daughter-in-law vanished into the house like smoke. I stood there among my roses and let the quiet soak into the ground. That night after dinner, simple pasta, a salad, the last of the lemon bars, I asked Daniel to walk with me. We made a slow loop around the block, the cicadas tuning up in the trees. Son, I said when we'd reached the corner, I won't be pushed into a role I haven't earned, and I won't be made into a story that isn't mine. I love you. I want you to build your life. I'm not your obstacle. He was quiet a long time. She's scared, he said finally. About money. About us not moving forward. Fear doesn't make a person cruel, I said softly. Choices do. He swallowed. What do you want me to do? Decide what kind of husband you want to be? I said. One who builds by partnership or one who wins by pressure. There's time to choose a different way, but there is not time to rewrite this house. When we came back, my daughter-in-law was waiting in the living room, a brittle light in her eyes. Did you enjoy your walk? She asked sweetly. Very much, I said. We discussed boundaries. She smiled with her lips. Good. I have one more. Let's hear it. If you won't contribute money, she said, then you can at least contribute labor. We'll make a schedule. Cleaning, cooking nights, yard days, non-negotiable. I looked at her, truly looked. A young woman who believed that control and security were the same thing. I had known that illusion once in other outfits at other ages. It never holds. No, I said gently. Her voice sharpened. Then this doesn't work. Then it doesn't, I agreed. Which means we move to logistics. Logistics, Daniel said, wary. I went to the sideboard and brought out the same folder, the occupancy agreement, and a second sheet I'd added that afternoon. 60-day notice template. Blank spaces for dates and signatures. I set them on the coffee table. I am not serving you an ultimatum tonight, I said, but I am making this clear: this home will not be a stage for hostility or humiliation. Take the weekend, read. Decide if you can live here under the original kindness of the arrangement and the clarity of these terms. If not, we'll set your move-out date for 60 days from Monday, and I will help you pack with love. Silence, the kind that hums. My daughter-in-law's hands curled at her sides. You can't, I can, I said not unkindly. And I will. Because I have a boundary too. I left the folder on the table and went to the kitchen to make tea. Behind me, paper whispered, the couch creaked. Someone exhaled a long, ragged breath. In the kitchen, the kettle clicked. I watched its small red eye go dark and thought not of victory, but of order, returning by degrees. Not loud, not dramatic. The quiet settling of a house when the windows are latched and the night air is kept where it belongs. I poured 3 cups. Tea, I called. There was no reply at first. Then Daniel's voice low. Yes, Mom. I brought the tray in. My daughter-in-law stared at the steam as if it wrote prophecies. She didn't take a cup. That was fine. The next move was hers, and I had already mapped mine. Sometimes people think strength is a shout. At 66, I know better. Strength is a file folder, a time-stamped photo, a kind sentence delivered at the exact right moment, and the steadiness to pour tea in the middle of a war. I set the tray down and folded my hands. Shall we talk logistics on Monday, I said, or shall we talk about paint colors for the living room? A pause. Daniel's mouth twitched, a suppressed, boyish laugh he hadn't let out in years. Paint colors, he said carefully. My daughter-in-law's eyes flashed. Then, cool as frost, she said, We'll see. Yes, I thought. We will. The weekend arrived like the long breath before a storm. I kept my rhythm, morning coffee at the kitchen table, pruning the roses, a walk to the market for fresh bread. On the surface, life looked unshaken. But beneath it, I could feel the threads tightening. My daughter-in-law barely spoke to me, moving through the house like a guest at a party she didn't want to attend. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed stuck between 2 gravitational pulls, one drawing him toward his wife's loyalty, the other toward the truth he could no longer deny. On Saturday morning, I took my tea to the porch. A neighbor, Ruth, strolled by with her dog and waved. How's everything at home? She called, eyes curious. Comfortably under renovation, I replied with a small smile. It was an answer that satisfied without revealing another librarian trick: you never give away the ending before the reader turns the page. By noon, I heard the low murmur of voices in the dining room. My name floated out in sharp, hushed syllables. I resisted the urge to linger at the doorway. Instead, I went upstairs and opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Inside lay the deed to the house, a copy of my will, and a neatly organized set of financial records. I ran my hand over the cool, thick paper of the deed. It was more than ownership, it was history memory, and the kind of stability my daughter-in-law had never truly understood. By the time I came back down, she was sitting at the kitchen table scrolling on her phone. "Looking for apartments?" I asked lightly. Her head snapped up. "No, just browsing." "Good. If you change your mind, I have friends who know the rental market well. They could help you?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "We're not leaving." "Then we'll follow the agreement," I said, pouring myself a glass of water. It was then I noticed the grocery bags on the counter, her shopping, not mine. Brand after brand I didn't buy. "I thought we agreed to coordinate food purchases," I said. "I'm just buying what I like," she replied with a shrug. "If you want some, you can transfer me for your share." I almost laughed. "Sweetheart, if I want something, I'll buy it myself. You keep your groceries separate, I'll keep mine." Her eyes darkened. "That's not how families work. Neither is invoicing your mother-in-law for living in her house." I said, calm and clear. The conversation ended there, but the air between us was different, charged, brittle, like the moment before glass shatters. Sunday afternoon, Daniel joined me in the garden. He didn't say much, just sat on the bench while I trimmed lavender. Eventually, he sighed. "She feels like you're shutting her out." "I'm shutting out a behavior, not a person," I said. "There's a difference." "She says you make her feel unwelcome." I met his gaze. "Daniel, welcome is not the same as surrender. She is welcome here so long as she treats this house and me with respect. If that's too high a price, she's free to leave." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You're not going to budge, are you?" "No," I said simply. "And if you were in my position, neither would you." We let the subject drop, but I could tell he was turning it over in his mind. Monday morning came, and I was ready. I set the occupancy agreement and the blank 60-day notice on the coffee table again, along with 2 pens. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room. They came downstairs together. My daughter-in-law's face was expressionless. Daniel looked as though he hadn't slept. "Well," I said, gesturing to the table, "shall we decide?" She crossed her arms. "We're staying. But I'm not agreeing to your little contract." "Then you're choosing the notice," I said. Daniel's head jerked toward her. "Wait. No, Daniel?" I said gently. "She's made her choice. And that choice triggers mine." Her voice rose. "You're kicking us out. You'll ruin your relationship with your son." "No," I said. "I'm protecting it. Because if we keep living like this, resentment will eat whatever love we have left. 60 days gives us all a chance to leave on civil terms." Daniel put his hands over his face. "God, this is insane." "What's insane," I said, "is living in constant battle in a house that was meant to be a home." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then slowly, Daniel lowered his hands. His eyes were tired, but there was something like relief there. "If this is what it takes," he said then. "Fine. We'll look." My daughter-in-law spun toward him. "You're siding with her? I'm siding with peace," he said quietly. Her mouth opened, then closed. She grabbed her phone and left the room. The house felt different once the decision was made. Lighter. Quieter. I didn't celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate in losing the daily presence of my son, even if the arrangement had been poisoned. But there was a deep, steady satisfaction in knowing I had drawn a line and kept it. 2 weeks later, I watched them pack boxes into a rented van. Daniel hugged me longer than I expected. My daughter-in-law gave me a stiff nod. Take care of each other, I told them. That's all that matters now. And as the van pulled away, I turned back to my porch, my roses, my quiet kitchen, my house. It had weathered storms before. It would weather this one too. The silence after they left was strange, not the peaceful quiet I'd imagined, but something heavier, like the echo of slammed doors. I woke early the next morning out of habit. For months, I'd been adjusting my schedule around theirs, cooking breakfast, before my daughter-in-law commandeered the kitchen, choosing quiet tasks when she was working from home, avoiding certain rooms to keep the peace. Now I could move freely. Yet I found myself standing in the hallway listening for footsteps that never came. I made a pot of coffee and drank it at the dining table, the morning sun spilling across the wood. It was just me and the tick of the clock, the creak of the old floorboards. For the first time in a long while, the house truly felt like mine again. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that the battle wasn't over. My daughter-in-law wasn't the kind of person to accept defeat gracefully. I'd seen the way she'd looked at me when she loaded the last box into the van, a glance that promised this wasn't the last time she'd try to challenge me. I decided that if she wanted to make it a game, I would change the rules. The first step was securing the foundation literally. I called a locksmith I trusted and had the locks changed the very next day. Daniel still had a spare key, of course, but I wanted no uncertainty about who had access to my home. Next, I went through every drawer, cabinet, and closet in the house. I wasn't looking for anything specific, but I wanted to see if they'd left anything behind intentionally or not. In the back of the guest room closet, I found a small box labeled Misk. Inside was a jumble of things, a broken phone charger, some costume jewelry, and tucked into an envelope, a few receipts. They were grocery receipts dated from months back. All items my daughter-in-law had bought, but every one of them listed as part of shared household on a split bill from a delivery app. My name was there as the secondary payer. It was proof in black and white of her little campaign to make it seem like I owed her for my own food. I smiled not because I needed the receipts for anything legal, but because they were a tangible reminder that I hadn't been imagining the manipulation. A week later, Daniel came by alone. He looked tired but lighter, as though the tension of the last few months had been wearing him down more than he'd realized. We sat in the kitchen, mugs of tea between us. "How's the new place?" I asked. "It's fine," he said. Smaller but quiet. He hesitated before adding, "She's still upset about how things ended here." I nodded. "I'm sure she is. She thinks you don't like her?" "I don't dislike her," I said evenly. "I dislike being treated like I'm a burden in my own home. There's a difference." He looked down at his tea. "I just wish things could have gone differently." "They still can," I said. "But only if she decides that respect goes both ways." He didn't argue, and that told me more than words could have. I didn't go out of my way to avoid her in the weeks that followed, but I didn't seek her out either. Life settled into a rhythm. Mornings in the garden, afternoons volunteering at the library, quiet evenings with a book and a cup of chamomile tea. Then, one Sunday after church, I overheard two women in the fellowship hall talking about how generous I'd been to let Daniel and his wife live with me. I stepped closer, pretending to refill my coffee, and caught the tail end of their conversation. My daughter-in-law had been telling people that I'd invited her to stay rent-free, but that I'd later gone back on my word and demanded they leave. It was a clever twist on the truth, not a complete lie, but a rearrangement of facts that made me look petty. I realized then that her campaign wasn't over. It had simply moved to a different battleground. That afternoon, I called my lawyer. I didn't want a lawsuit, I wanted security. We drafted a formal statement clarifying that the house was mine, that Daniel and his wife had lived here temporarily under a verbal agreement, and that the arrangement had ended at my discretion. It wasn't a public document, but it was there if I ever needed to counter her narrative. Then I started working on something more subtle. I organized a small gathering at my home, just a few close friends, neighbors, and family members. We shared food, laughter, and stories. I made sure to mention in passing how good it felt to be managing the house again after the stress of too many cooks in the kitchen. People are smart, they can read between the lines. 2 months later, Daniel stopped by again. This time he smiled more easily. She's still herself, he said, but I think she's realizing she pushed too far here. I hope so, I replied. For both your sakes. He nodded, and for the first time in a long while I felt a flicker of hope that we might find some common ground again, not today, maybe not even this year, but someday. Because this wasn't about winning, it was about reclaiming peace. And I had no intention of letting that go again. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day when the sunlight is just beginning to turn golden, slanting through the front windows. I'd been sorting through old photo albums in the living room, the kind of slow, quiet work that lets your mind drift. The knock on the door was firm. Not the polite two-tap kind, but the kind that demands to be answered. When I opened it, my daughter-in-law stood there, arms crossed her chin, lifted like she was walking into a courtroom as the star witness. Daniel wasn't with her. "I need to talk to you," she said. No greeting, no preamble. I stepped aside. "Come in." She moved into the living room, her eyes flicking briefly over the open albums on the coffee table as if she were assessing how much of my life was on display. She sat uninvited on the armchair opposite me. "I've been thinking," she began. "The way things ended. It wasn't fair." I raised an eyebrow. To whom? To me? To Daniel? We had an understanding when we moved in. You promised to help us get on our feet, and instead you pushed us out. I leaned back against the sofa. I didn't push you out. I gave you a choice: stay under clear terms or find your own place. You made your choice. Her lips tightened. It's not that simple. Daniel is still your son. This house could be his one day. I don't think it's unreasonable for us to have some security now. There it was. Not even dressed up in polite words this time, she was angling for a claim on my home. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked. She smoothed her skirt, an old tell I'd noticed when she was nervous. "I think it would be best if you transferred partial ownership of the house into Daniel's name now. That way there's no uncertainty later." I stared at her for a long moment. In my mind, I could hear the echo of her earlier demand, the one about paying her for food and lodging in my own home. It was the same arrogance now, in a bigger, bolder shape. "No," I said. Her eyes flashed. "You can't just say no without considering it." "I've considered it," I said evenly. "This house is mine. It will remain mine until the day I decide otherwise. And no one, not you, not Daniel, not anyone, will pressure me into changing that." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Do you have any idea how cold you sound? You're pushing your own family away?" I met her gaze. Family doesn't try to take what isn't theirs. For a moment I thought she might actually shout, but instead she sat back, her eyes narrowing. "Fine," she said. "But don't be surprised when you find yourself alone in this house wondering why no one comes around. That would be my choice," I said softly. "Not yours." She stood abruptly. "I'll tell Daniel you refused." "Tell him the truth," I said, "that you asked for something that wasn't yours and I said no." She didn't reply. She just turned and walked to the door, pulling it shut behind her, with a little more force than necessary. The quiet that followed was different from before. It wasn't the echo of slammed doors this time, it was the stillness of a battle decisively won. I sat there for a while looking at the photo albums. Images of Daniel as a boy, his hair sticking up in every direction, grinning with a missing tooth. Pictures of family Christmases, birthdays, quiet Sunday afternoons. Those memories were mine, as much a part of this home as the walls themselves. And I realized something. My daughter-in-law could spin whatever stories she liked out there, but in here, within these walls, I still held the truth. I still held the history. And that couldn't be taken with a signature on a piece of paper. 2 days later, Daniel called. "She told me what happened. he said. His voice was tired, and I asked, "And I wish she hadn't gone over without me. I don't agree with what she asked." That caught me off guard. "You don't?" "No," he said. "I know the house is yours. I know you've worked for it your whole life. She just, she's always worried about the future. Sometimes that turns into other things." I almost laughed at the understatement. "Daniel, I hope you understand my decisions about this house aren't about shutting you out. They're about keeping it safe. And keeping me safe." "I get that," he said quietly. "I just wish things were easier." "So do I said. There was a pause. Then softly, "I'll come by next week." Alone. When I hung up, I realized the anger I'd been holding onto for months had shifted. It wasn't gone, but it wasn't burning quite so hot. Maybe there was still a path back to some kind of peace with my son. But with her, no, that path had been sealed off for good. And I was fine with that. I had drawn my lines. I had defended my home. And I had done it without lowering myself to her games. That, I decided, was a victory worth keeping. Daniel came by on a gray afternoon, the kind where the sky feels heavy enough to press down on your shoulders. I had made a pot of chicken soup thinking we might share a quiet meal, and when I opened the door, the sight of him standing there alone, no tight-lipped wife beside him, eased something in my chest. He looked older than I remembered, though. Only a few weeks had passed since I'd last seen him. His hair seemed thinner at the temples, his eyes tired, but there was a lightness in his step I hadn't seen in months. "I thought I'd take you up on that tea," he said with a faint smile. I ushered him inside. We sat at the kitchen table, steam rising from our mugs, and for a while we just talked about small things: the weather, his work, the old maple tree in the front yard that he used to climb as a boy. But I knew there was a reason for this visit, and so did he. Eventually, he set his mug down and leaned back in his chair. "She told me what she asked you," he said. I didn't respond right away. I wanted him to speak first, to lay it out in his own words. "I didn't agree with it," he continued. "I know this house means more to you than just a place to live. I grew up here. I get it." Relief washed over me, but I kept my expression neutral. "Then why didn't you stop her?" His gaze dropped to the table. "Because stopping her isn't simple. You know how she is when she sets her mind on something. If I push back too hard, it becomes a war. And he hesitated. "I've been choosing my battles." I studied him. "Daniel, there's a difference between keeping the peace and letting someone erode it piece by piece." He nodded, his mouth tightening. "I know. Lately I've been wondering if I've been letting too much slide." The quiet stretched between us. I could feel the weight of unspoken things hanging there, things I suspected he wasn't ready to admit. Finally, he said, "I wanted to apologize for putting you in that position, for making you feel like you had to defend your own home against your own family." "Daniel," I said softly, "you're my son. That hasn't changed. But you need to understand she crossed a line, and if you can't see where that line is, she'll cross it again." He gave a small, humorless laugh. "She already has. More than once." That admission hung in the air like the first crack in a dam. After lunch, we moved to the living room. I brought out some of the photo albums I'd been sorting the week before, and we leafed through them together. He lingered on certain pictures, himself at age 6, grinning in the sandbox. The Christmas we'd built a tree entirely from books. His first car, which he'd bought with 2 summers' worth of wages from mowing lawns. At one point he sighed. "You know, she's been asking questions about the will." The words hit me like a cold splash of water. "The will. Yeah. She wants to know if you've made one, if the house is included." I closed the album slowly. "And what did you tell her? That it's none of our business until you choose to share it?" She didn't like that answer. I sat back, the pieces sliding into place. Her insistence that I pay her for food and accommodation, her push for partial ownership now this, it wasn't random. It was a calculated effort to stake a claim on my future while I was still alive. And Daniel, whether he realized it or not, was being dragged along for the ride. The next day, I called my lawyer again. We updated my will not because I was changing my mind about who would inherit, but because I wanted airtight language. The house would pass to Daniel upon my death, but with conditions it could never be sold without my explicit prior consent in writing, and no one outside my direct bloodline could hold ownership unless I allowed it. It was a message written in legal ink that no amount of persuasion or emotional manipulation could undo. I didn't tell Daniel right away. I wanted to see what his next move would be, and what hers would be when she realized her usual tactics wouldn't work here. It didn't take long. A week later, she called me. Her voice was syrupy, her tone a little too sweet. "I've been thinking," she said, "maybe we got off on the wrong foot. Why don't we come for dinner one night next week? Just the three of us. A fresh start." It might have sounded genuine to anyone else, but I could hear the gears turning behind her words. This wasn't an apology. It was reconnaissance. "All right," I said. "Next Thursday." When I hung up, I knew exactly how I'd handle it. On Thursday evening, I set the table the way I always had when Daniel was little. His favorite soup-warm bread, the old china plates with the faded blue flowers. When they arrived, I welcomed them in with a smile. She seemed almost relieved, as if the tension had been smoothed over. But halfway through the meal, she began steering the conversation toward future plans again. How hard it was to save for a house in this market. How Daniel deserved stability. How families needed to plan ahead. I let her talk. Then quietly, I said, "I've already made plans. The house is taken care of in my will. It will pass to Daniel with conditions to protect it from being sold or transferred outside the family." The flicker in her eyes told me she understood exactly what that meant. Daniel glanced at me, then at her. "That's fair," he said simply. She didn't speak for the rest of the meal. When they left, Daniel hugged me. It was brief, but it felt different. Solid, real. And I realized something as I closed the door behind them. The fight wasn't just about keeping my home safe. It was about making sure Daniel saw the truth clearly without the fog she'd tried to pull over both of us. For the first time in months, I felt like he finally did. It started with a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't pick up. I've learned that nothing good comes from answering calls with strange IDs, but something made me swipe anyway. "Hello." A pause, then a woman's voice, sharp and brisk. "This is Karen Lee from the Glenview Assisted Living Center. I'm calling to confirm your application." For a moment, I thought she had the wrong number. "Application? I haven't applied for anything." "That's odd," she said. "We received forms submitted in your name requesting placement here starting next month. It includes your personal details, your address," and I cut her off. "I did not submit that." She hesitated. "Well, I'm sorry, ma'am, but we require written confirmation before we can proceed with an intake. Would you like to cancel the application now?" "Yes," I said, my voice cold. "Cancel it. And if you can send me a copy of the paperwork." The envelope arrived 2 days later. I sat at the kitchen table, turning over each page carefully. There it was, my name, my date of birth, even a forged signature that almost looked like mine if you didn't know what to look for. But the handwriting in the margins, the way certain letters looped too high, I recognized it. I'd seen it on grocery lists, on post-it notes stuck to the fridge when they lived here. It was her. My daughter-in-law had tried to sign me up for an assisted living facility without my knowledge. The intention was clear: get me out of my house, move me into care, and free up this place for her and Daniel. I sat there for a long while, the papers spread out in front of me, my tea growing cold. This wasn't just arrogance anymore, it was an escalation, a test to see how far she could push. That evening, I called Daniel. "Do you know anything about this?" I asked, my voice calm but icy. There was a pause on the other end, about what I told him. The silence that followed was so heavy I could hear his breath catch. She didn't, he said finally. But his voice wasn't certain. It was the voice of someone who already knew the answer, but couldn't quite bear to say it out loud. She did, I said. I have the paperwork. I've seen her handwriting. Daniel groaned. I'll come over. When he arrived, I had the forms laid out on the dining table. He stood there reading every line, his hands tightening at his sides. She told me last week, he said slowly, that she had a plan to secure our future. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't want to fight. You didn't think to ask if that plan involved forcing me out of my own home? His shoulders slumped. I didn't think she'd go this far. Well, she did. And Daniel, this is criminal. Forging my signature, filing false applications. If I wanted to, I could take this to the police. His eyes met mine. Will you? I took a breath. Not yet. But only because I think this is your last chance to make a choice. The next day, Daniel came back alone. He looked exhausted, his hair uncombed, his shirt wrinkled. I told her I can't do this anymore, he said. That if she can't respect my family, then there's nothing left between us. I felt the weight of those words. And she said, I had to choose between her and you. The air in the room seemed to still. And what did you say? He swallowed. I said, you've been in my life for 40 years. She's been in it for 6. The choice was obvious. It wasn't a victory to celebrate with fireworks or champagne. It was quiet, bittersweet. Because I knew endings, even necessary ones, hurt. Over the next week, Daniel moved back into his old room temporarily while he sorted out the details. I didn't pry. We spoke in small doses, letting the air between us settle after so much strain. One evening, he stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes and said, You were right. About all of it. I just didn't want to see it. I dried a plate and set it in the cupboard. Sometimes love makes us blind. The trick is not to stay blind forever. A few days later, I took the forged application, slid it into an envelope, and locked it in my desk drawer. I didn't need to wave it in her face. She already knew I had it. And that knowledge that I could use it if she ever tried anything again was enough. She didn't come around after that. No phone calls, no attempts to make amends. The silence was its own kind of peace. But I had one more step to take before I could truly breathe easy. The following week, I called my lawyer again. We made it official, an irrevocable trust for the house with strict terms ensuring it could never be sold, signed away, or claimed by anyone without my consent. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about ensuring that no one in the years ahead could try to strip me of what I had built. When I signed the papers, I felt something loosen inside me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't on defense. I was standing on solid ground. That night, Daniel and I ate dinner together in the kitchen, the windows open to the cool night air. There was still a road ahead for him, the divorce, the untangling of their shared life. But there was also a steadiness in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. You saved yourself, he said quietly. And you saved me too. I smiled faintly. Sometimes the best way to protect the people you love is to show them what's worth fighting for. My name is Margaret Callahan, and if you've been following my story, you know this fight was never really about rent money or groceries. It was about respect, about boundaries, about the quiet, steady truth that if you don't defend what's yours, whether that's your home, your dignity, or your peace, someone will take it from you inch by inch until you're left with nothing but regret. The battle with my daughter-in-law ended in a way I didn't expect, not with shouting or slammed doors, but with silence. After Daniel told her he was done, she moved out within a week. No farewell visits, no apology. Just the quiet sound of her car pulling out of the driveway and not returning. But endings, even clean ones, leave ripples. For a while the house felt different, Not lighter, not yet. Just still. The kind of stillness that comes after a long storm when you're waiting to see if the wind will pick up again. Daniel kept to himself those first days. He spent hours on the phone lawyers, friends sorting out the logistics of separating lives that had been tangled together for 6 years. I cooked for us both, left food on the counter for him, and let him come to me when he was ready. It wasn't until a week later that we sat down together in the living room and really talked. "She's been sending messages," he admitted, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Not apologizing, not even asking to come back. Just blaming me, saying I let you poison our marriage. I let out a breath through my nose. People like that don't take responsibility, Daniel. They rewrite the story so they can live with it. He nodded slowly. I know that now. In the weeks that followed, life began to take on a new rhythm. The phone didn't ring with her voice on the other end. The front door didn't open to her footsteps. Daniel started fixing things around the house without being asked, tightening a loose cabinet hinge, painting the porch rail, changing the oil in my car. It wasn't just about helping me. I think it was his way of reminding himself that he still belonged here, that this house was still his home. One afternoon, I found him in the attic sorting through boxes. I thought we could clear out some of the old stuff, he said. Make space. We worked side by side for hours, going through old school projects, holiday decorations, photo albums. It was the first time in years I'd seen him genuinely relaxed, smiling at little memories, instead of carrying the weight of someone else's demands. Then one morning in early spring, I got a letter. Not a typed formal thing, a handwritten note in a plain white envelope, my name on the front in careful script. I knew who it was from before I even opened it. Inside, the words were short and clipped. "Margaret, I've moved out of the area. I won't be bothering you again. For what it's worth, I hope you and Daniel find peace." I sat at the kitchen table staring at it. No apology, no acknowledgement of what she'd done. But the words "I won't be bothering you again" carried a finality I hadn't dared to hope for. I tucked the letter into the same envelope as the forged assisted living application and locked them both in my desk drawer. Proof in case it was ever needed. But more than that, they were reminders not of her power, but of mine. That night, I told Daniel about the letter. "She's gone," he said, his voice even. No anger, no longing, just a fact. "Yes," I said. "She's gone." We didn't toast or celebrate. We just sat in the living room, the lamplight pooling between us, and let the quiet settle. In the months that followed, I made changes. Not to the house, I loved it just the way it was, but to how I lived in it. I reopened the garden I'd let go to weeds. I hosted book club meetings again in the den, the sound of women's laughter filling the rooms. I let neighbors drop by for tea without worrying about icy glares or whispered judgments. And slowly the stillness in the house turned into something else: contentment. Daniel and I found a new way of being around each other. We still had our disagreements, what mother and grown son don't, but the undercurrent of tension that had been there for years was gone. He stopped defending the indefensible, and I stopped feeling like I had to prove I wasn't the enemy. One afternoon, we sat on the porch with coffee, watching the sunlight filter through the trees. Daniel turned to me and said, "I'm sorry it took me so long to see her for who she really was." I reached over and patted his hand. "It's not about how long it took, Daniel. It's about the fact that you saw it at all." The last piece of the puzzle fell into place one sunny Saturday when I heard a knock on the door. I opened it to find her standing there. I hadn't seen her in months. She looked different, thinner, paler, the sharp edges of her confidence dulled. She didn't try to step inside. "I just came to return this," she said, holding out a small velvet pouch. Inside was the gold bracelet I'd given her as a wedding gift. "It's yours?" I said, holding it back out to her. She shook her head. "No, I don't want it. I don't want anything from you." Her voice cracked a little on the last word, and for the first time I wondered if maybe just Maybe she was starting to see herself clearly. She turned to go, then paused. I know you think I'm a terrible person. Maybe I am. But I did love Daniel. I just loved the wrong way. I didn't answer. Some truths don't need a reply. I watched her walk down the driveway and out of sight. And just like that, the last shadow lifted from the house. That night, as I sat in my favorite chair with a book in my lap, I realized something I had won. Not in the sense of beating someone else, but in reclaiming my own life, in knowing I didn't have to live under anyone's thumb again. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. You don't always have to fight with raised voices to protect what's yours. Sometimes the most powerful defense is a quiet, unwavering no. So if you're ever in a situation like mine, if someone tries to make you pay for the right to exist in your own space, remember, you don't owe anyone rent for the life you've built. It's yours. If you've been through something similar, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. And if this one resonated with you, subscribe to Grace's Truth for more real stories about standing your ground, reclaiming your power, and finding peace on your own terms. Because trust me, you'll regret staying silent more than you'll ever regret speaking up.